Hello learners, I am Dr. Sahabuddin Ahamed, Assistant Professor Guest Faculty in the Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Chhattisgarh, Bilaspur, India. Welcome you all to this virtual lecture. Today I will explore post-colonialism. It is a field that studies the effects of colonialism on cultures, societies and literatures. In this lecture, I will discuss the key concepts, key theories, historical context and examples of notable writers who write back to the empire. By the end, dear learners, you will have a clear understanding of the foundations of post-colonial studies. Now, to begin with, post-colonialism is a branch of contemporary theory that examines the cultural, economic, political and psychological effects of European colonialism upon formerly colonized societies, countries, cultures, and the nature of those societies, countries, reactions, responses to it. It examines how formerly colonized countries, societies responded to colonialism through resistance and how they reclaim, assert their cultural, political and linguistic identity autonomy. Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith and Helen Tiffin defined the term post-colonial to cover all the culture affected by the imperial processes from the moment of colonization to the present day. Page number 2. In other words, the term post-colonial is a strategy of reading and writing literature, culture and society. It is a mode of representation that uses counter narrative, counter discourse that resist dominant Eurocentric discourse. Furthermore, the term post-colonial emerged as a response to dominant Eurocentric assumptions that European culture is greater than all other culture, and such hegemony calls upon non-European culture and language backward, inferior, degraded. Thereby, post-colonial questions the unequal and uneven forces of cultural representation, says Homike Bhabha. Now continuing from the previous point, the hyphenated term post-colonial indicates a historical period that comes after the end of European colonialism, and the non-hyphenated term without hyphen post-colonial indicates neither a chronology nor a period after colonization, because the legacy of colonialism or unequal power dynamics has not finished yet, and it has shaped our knowledge and identities without we realize it. How colonial ideology present in the past and the present. According to the critic Edward Said, in post-colonial time, in our time, though direct colonialism has ended, it continues to exist in a kind of general cultural sphere as well as specific ideological, economic, social, political practices due to the acceptance of the monolithic colonial cultural practices by the post-colonial nation states. Page number 9. Now next, let us look at some aims of post-colonial criticism. Firstly, I would like to talk post-colonial re-examines the history of European colonialism and its effects from the perspective of the colonized. Secondly, post-colonial focuses on power relations, class, gender, representation, subordination and identity formation during and after colonization. Thirdly, post-colonial gives voice to those peoples, cultures historically and culturally silenced, erased. Fourthly, it reclaims colonized peoples' past, their cultural heritage. Next, it represents indigenous peoples, cultures, histories in literature from their own perspective. Next, it challenges colonialist stereotypes that demonize and dehumanize non-Western cultures, peoples, societies negatively and stereotypically as inferior and primitive. Post-colonial questions the established literary canon, that is European canonical text, and resist its dominant perspective according to Gina Whisker, page number 11, because of its universalism approach that has limitation of being silent on the issues of colonialism, and because it glorifying Western cultural values, because many canonical texts imposed Western cultural values while ignoring, excluding or marginalizing different experiences of colonized peoples from non-Western countries under the imperial rule. Postcolonial examines the process of decolonization. Finally, postcolonial celebrates hybrid, intercultural, transcultural notions of nation, culture, identity and community. So, continuing, there are main questions regarding the term postcolonialism. Firstly, how is literature situated within the context of a critique of colonial discourse? That means it explores the relationship between literature and colonial discourse. It provides a platform for anti-colonial resistance. Second question, how do colonial power relations persist after decolonization? That means colonial power relations persist in social, cultural, economic, political areas which continue to affect formerly colonized countries in the post-colonial time in our time. Third question, how does the impact of European colonization continue to shape the modern world? That means the legacy of European colonization is still shaping the modern world, our lives in multiple ways, including cultural norms, economic inequality, global inequality and geopolitical rivalry, geopolitical hierarchies. Now, I would like to turn to historical context that gave rise to post-colonial thought, post-colonial study. First of all, colonialism, it refers to conquest and control of weaker country by more powerful country. It is the subjugation of colonized peoples, exploitation of natural resources in the colonies, the imposition of European language and cultural practices, that is English language, literature, colonial education upon the non-Western peoples, and the erasure of beliefs, customs, histories, traditions of the colonized peoples. The main motives are to economic profit, other motives were colonization, that is to bring about civilization, education, progress under the marks of colonization. European colonial expansion, that is found in Asia, Africa, Caribbean and the Latin America. From the 15th to 20th centuries, imperial powers were Spain, Portugal, France, England, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and under British Empire the countries were India, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Burma, Sudan. Under French colonial rule, Algeria, Indochina, French West Africa. Colonization reshaped global politics, culture and economics through multiple ways, through colonial trade, exchange, forced displacement, migration, diaspora, genocide, racism and establishment of hospital, education, Christianity, government, migrant labor, slavery, indentured labor and so many other things. The study of post-colonialism became prominent after the Second World War as many nations questioned and revolted against European colonialism. For example, Indian Mutiny in 1857, Irish Uprising 1916, and many nations gained independence and decolonization claims for independence and its own rule by its own people, and it removed colonial powers over colonized peoples. That means it gained independence and sovereignty. So, at this point, dear learners, it is important to examine the origins of post-colonialism. Post-colonialism, that is post-colonial literature and post-colonial theory, emerged as an academic discipline in the UK, USA, Australia and many other countries since the 1980s. Now let us look at some of the key theorists in postcolonial studies. Firstly, Franz Fanon, who described psychological effects of colonialism, that is inferiority complex and decolonial violence. Colonial education system, that is how colonized people denied their own culture, history, geography, and they were taught in schools that European language and culture were superior and their cultures were inferior. So colonial mindset was created by Europeans to persuade colonized that their culture is backward, inferior, while European culture and race is superior. Secondly, Homi K. Bhabha, influential postcolonial critic, theorist who introduced the concept hybridity, mimicry and ambivalence that I will discuss in next slide. Continuing from the previous point, third, Edward Said, who introduced the term Orientalism. It is the Western construction of the Orient as exotic and inferior in comparison to the West. So West is defined modern, rational, superior, civilized, while the East is compared as inferior, primitive, irrational. And finally, the most influential critic is theorist is Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, who popularized the term subaltern. It refers to the representation and silencing of the marginalized communities, that is women. That is how colonial discourse is worse for women who are silenced and cannot speak. The epistemic violence of colonialism ignores, devalues, marginalizes their culture, history, language and belief and knowledge system. Now moving to the next slide, I intend to explore core concepts in postcolonialism. So dear learners, there are several core concepts in postcolonial studies. Firstly, I would like to discuss colonial discourse. It refers to the language, narratives and knowledge system that are used to justify European colonization, domination from a single perspective. For example, colonial discourse uses stereotypes, binary opposition, hierarchies to demonize, dehumanize, marginalize peoples and cultures of colonized countries. However, postcolonial literature and theory challenges and subverts these ideas or narratives. For example, Edward Said's Orientalism. Secondly, language and resistance. Literature is a central concern in postcolonial studies. Language is a tool of resistance. There is a debate whether postcolonial writers should use colonizers' language or native language. Chinua Achebe uses English language while Ngugi wa Thiong'o rejects English completely. He advocates for using native African language in order to preserve their cultural traditions and values. Thirdly, one of the central ideas in postcolonial literature is writing back. Postcolonial writers write back to the empire, to the center, challenging colonial discourse and reclaiming their identity. For example, Jean Rhys rewrites White Sargasso Sea and Chinua Achebe rewrites Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. Fourthly, the term othering refers to the process of defining colonized peoples as other or inferior or different from European people. Fifthly, hybridity. This term was introduced by Homi K. Bhabha. Hybridity refers to the mixing and impurity of all cultures. Hybridity identifies mixing culture, mixed culture under colonial influence. It refers to the influence of both culture, Western, non-Western. It refers to belonging to more than one culture. So culture is not static or pure but impure. It also refers to how culture undergo transformation, exchange, negotiations. So hybridity challenges rigid categories of colonizer and colonized, East and West. For example, Caribbean or diasporic literature. Mimicry. The term mimicry occurs when colonized people imitate colonizers, their behaviors and resist and reinforces colonial authority. The term ambivalence is the paradoxical nature of colonial discourse, that it hides because it depicts colonized subject as inferior and different from the colonizer, and at the same time the colonized can undermine the difference by assuming colonizers' attitude, education, language, dress. Now coming to subaltern. Subaltern, that is the marginalized group, especially working class and women who are excluded from history and dominant power structure knowledge system. Finally, the term decolonizing the mind, the term was coined by Thiongo. It means reclaiming indigenous perspective. It is the use of indigenous language to protect indigenous people's culture, memory, value, knowledge system, principles. It is the questioning of the use of the language of the colonizer. So, I have discussed the core concept in postcolonial study. Now, turning to the next slide, some recurring themes in postcolonial studies including colonial power, violence and dominance. Colonizers use colonial methods to control and colonize distant lands, territories, to impose their religion, language, culture, principle, values, ideology, and to establish colonial governments, education, to exploit colonized people's natural resources, undermining indigenous traditions. Anti-colonial resistance focuses on challenging colonial domination, narratives, discourse. Identity, most important theme, how colonized individuals and societies define themselves after colonization, that is asserting and reclaiming their identity and culture. The theme of otherness looks at how colonized peoples were depicted as different from European or depicted as inferior, savage. Cultural displacement refers to the disruption of culture, identity, way of life caused by colonization. It highlights how colonized peoples experienced a loss of their cultural tradition, how they felt alienated from their cultural heritage tradition due to the imposition of colonizers' culture, language, values. In addition, colonized traditional ways of thinking, storytelling and governance are replaced, erased, marginalized, demonized by the colonizers' colonial method. As a result, colonized peoples are caught between two cultures, that is western and non-western cultural tradition, that is between east and west. Hybridity refers to cultural mixing. Colonized people's selves are divided, torn between native cultural tradition and colonial modernity. Search for voice and representation. Transculturalism, it refers to cross-cultural flows that transcends the boundaries of the nation states, and it is created by European colonization. Now, transnational migration, this is the similar theme, how colonizers and colonized transcend the borders of the nation state. Postcolonial eco-criticism, it refers to the relation between colonization, culture and environment. Postcolonial eco-criticism examines how colonial histories, colonial power structure shaped Western ecological practices, ecological crisis, degradation and human nature relationship in the formerly colonized societies, countries. Next, let us take a look at the notable postcolonial authors and their works. So, there are many notable postcolonial authors, and these authors exemplify postcolonial ideas. Chinua Achebe highlights British impacts of British colonialism and the reclamation of African identity in his novella Things Fall Apart, published in 1958. Ngugi wa Thiong'o focuses on African languages and African cultural identity in decolonizing the mind. His focus is to decolonize language and to introduce to use African languages. Indian author Salman Rushdie explores cultural hybridities, cultural identities in postcolonial societies in his novel Midnight's Children. Another Derek Walcott, he blends European and Caribbean identity in his work Omeras Dream on Monkey Mountain. Jean Rhys from Dominica rewrites colonial narratives from a marginalized perspective in his novel White Sargasso Sea. So together these writers demonstrate the diversity and richness of post-colonial literature. Now next, this slide highlights the application and relevance of post-colonial study. To begin with, post-colonial study helps reinterpret history from non-European perspective, colonized perspective. Post-colonial main goal is to critically re-examine power relations, identity, representation in formerly colonized countries, societies. Moreover, post-colonial theory is interdisciplinary because it is widely used in literary analysis, cultural studies, political theory and many other fields. And post-colonial reveals how colonial legacies exist, persist in global inequality and media. Today, post-colonial criticism also addresses contemporary issues like globalization, diaspora, neo-colonial practices, that is neocolonialism. Now moving to the next slide, critique of post-colonialism. Despite its relevance in our time, it is criticized. Firstly, it is overly theoretical and inaccessible, which can limit practical application. Moreover, post-colonial may overlook economic and material realities, focusing instead on cultural or textual analysis. In addition, post-colonial framework ignores the issue of neocolonialism, that means leaving contemporary power imbalances, contemporary unequal power relationship inequality, that is underexplored. Furthermore, it is dominated by Western academia, limiting global inclusivity and diverse scholarly voices. That is why it is criticized. Finally, post-colonial can generalize diverse post-colonial experiences, providing account for nuanced differences across region. Now, in conclusion, I believe it is clear that post-colonialism examines the enduring effects of colonialism on formerly colonized societies, cultures, peoples. Post-colonial emphasizes language, identity, hybridity and cultural resistance. Post-colonial opposes unequal power relations, unequal cultural representation. Post-colonial gives expression to colonized experience. It rewrites history from colonized perspective, non-European perspectives. It provides alternate histories, alternate cultural tradition of colonized societies. It also reminds us that our knowledge is a product of colonialism, because the legacy of European colonization has not ended yet. It continues in our time. That means colonial legacy is still shaping the modern world. Post-colonial invites ongoing debate about justice, equality and representation. Post-colonial studies help us understand how literature reflects, how literature critiques and reshapes society culture in both colonial and post-colonial context. So dear learners, that is all for today. Now we have completed the topic Introduction to Post-colonialism, and soon we will meet again with another video. Thank you for watching and listening to this lecture.